Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this Red Game Theatre video, we're going to be tackling an interview, a rather fascinating one actually, that is currently doing the rounds on the internet. It was conducted by Wired magazines and is touted to be the inside story of the Xbox. Now, the reason I find this interview very fascinating is because of a couple of key points. One, the Xbox team go into the change of focus. Remember when the original Xbox One was unveiled and how, well, public reception wasn't that great, and that's putting it mildly. Well, Microsoft kind of go into why they had the change of focus, and yes, of course, the cynical reason, and the pretty obvious reason, is that, well, people just were not very impressed at all. However, with the new team came a very different vision, and on top of that, they also discuss how backwards compatibility is incredibly important to the Microsoft team, to the Xbox team, and how they feel that it's one of those things which previous generations just wasn't really getting quite right. Essentially, if you were to migrate from an older console to the newer console, backwards compatibility just wasn't quite where you would expect it to be. And there's a couple of other very interesting points as well. As I said, this is a very lengthy interview. I'll link the full article, of course, in the video description. Now, we're going to be starting things out from the beginning of the Xbox One as original reveal, which of course was in May 2013. Now, the console was launched in November, but it had a rather difficult, a rather turbulent, I suppose, first couple of years. And Phil Spencer has decided to comment on that. He said that I totally understand what you're talking about in terms of the launch of the Xbox One and that TV stuff and Kinect. It was just the vision was different. Phil Spencer continues, I understood the vision that the prior team had, and hopefully our last 3 years show the focus on the gaming customer is critically important. So why was there such a change of heart? Well, don't forget that Phil Spencer himself was appointed to be the head of the Xbox division in March 2014. Now, of course, as we all know, by the time March 2014 came about, the Xbox One had already launched, so he couldn't exactly pull all the Xbox Ones off the shelf and just decide to essentially tweak the innards of the system. Obviously, that was just impossible. But what he does say is that basically, the decisions were made at the top of Microsoft himself. In other words, his words exactly, it's been nice to see what Satya Nadella talks about now. The support we have for being in the games industry and not being something else is incredibly high. I admit that's a very PR answer, but essentially I think they kind of realised, I mean as a company, not just, you know, the Xbox division, but the entire company. And you can see this, by the way, in recent decisions that Microsoft have made. Microsoft actually, well, turned the Xbox chief, Phil Spencer, and actually promoted him to the Microsoft Leadership Group. Now, what that essentially tells us is that they are putting a lot more emphasis on the gaming division. They're realizing now that it's still part of the Microsoft ecosystem, and this is really how they are going about things, and it's a much smarter way. Previously, if you saw the original Xbox One conference, it was a disaster. It was terrible, and Don Matrick, I don't know how he got the approval for the original vision, and I kind of understood where he was going with it. Like, some of the ideas were kind of cool. The problem is, they were just implemented with abandonment to gaming, and I think if there had been lots of killer apps on show at E3, and instead they kind of talked more about the, you know, the DVR and all of this stuff as an optional, people would have received the console a lot better. However, with that, combined with the online requirements, always online requirements, it just killed the momentum of the system. Now, a few extra comments were made by Albert Penello and the rest of the team on gaming as a whole. So, one problem with gaming, and this is particularly with digital titles, is that you can almost feel like you've bought them and you don't really own them. It's essentially like a license. And not only that, titles as a whole, if you were to buy the physical cartridges, especially true back in the day, like, for example, if you owned a Genesis / Mega Drive, you were screwed if you then wanted to sell that system and play it on your Sega Saturn. I think, actually, as a slight aside, there were early plans to allow you to have backwards compatibility with the Sega Saturn, with the cartridge slot, but I believe they scrapped them. I'm not 100% sure on that, so do some due diligence if you so desire. However, you have companies like Nintendo, of course, where you've had to buy games several times over, essentially like even NES classics, which is absolutely ridiculous. So Albert Penello actually comments on this. He says that the original Xbox was the DirectX box, and this of course refers directly to the DirectX software, the API, which was introduced back in Windows 95. Now the idea behind DirectX and PC gaming was very simple. It was to make gaming continuous, so you could buy a game and in theory at least you could pretty much play it forever. So if you were to buy a copy of a game and then you upgraded to Windows 98, you wouldn't really have an issue to continue to play that. In fact, he quotes that if you bought a copy of Worms 2 back in 97, it still works on Windows 10 today. But console gaming not so much. Consoles were more bespoke than PCs. Why can't I make Miss Pac-Man run on the Pac-Man on arcade board? Well, they are two totally different boards. Atari was an arcade company, Nintendo was an arcade company. Now, another lady, who is the general manager of publishing at Xbox, her name is Shannon Loftus, says, and I quote, "Just like there are movies that don't do well at the box office but then become cult hits, it's the same thing that can happen with games. So before the current console generation, it felt like everyone was hesitant to try something different. Suddenly you have these small developers making games that are surprise hits, and then this revitalizes the ecosystem." In fact, many at Xbox felt that it was impossible to get the original Xbox to actually work with the Xbox One, with the latest generation. But an individual by the name of Spencer Perrault actually decided to prove them wrong. And eventually he managed to drag Bill Stillwell into his office and literally just fired up a game, and, well, that was it. So what does all of this mean? Well, to me it's a fascinating insight and a discussion piece, if nothing else. I have to admit, when it comes to game preservation, companies often have this almost throwaway philosophy, because it's so difficult to preserve games. I mean, it has been. It's getting a lot easier now. But, for example, let's say you had a Mega Drive / Mega CD back in the day, or, if you prefer, a Genesis / Sega CD, and then you upgraded to a Sega Saturn, even though it's technically still Sega, you couldn't just plop in your copy of, like, Thunderhawk into your Saturn. It just would not physically work, of course. But there are some, you know, when it comes to digital, I don't like the fact that you don't own a game, for certain. But here's the thing, like, there doesn't seem to be a perfect model. To me, what would be great is, the most obvious one for me is physical media. Now, physical media does definitely degrade after a certain period of time. I've heard that some older games, for example the PS1, can sometimes be a bit dicey, especially if the disc wasn't particularly well preserved right now. So that can be an issue. Collectors also have some nightmares when it comes to purchasing older cassettes, older discs, especially for the PC. But I think the point that the Xbox team is trying to make is quite simple. If you have a game which could, at least in theory, sell over multiple console generations. For example, if you had a title like Shenmue, look at Shenmue. Look how, you know, it sold okay, but it certainly wasn't enough to keep the Dreamcast in business. And much could be said for Panzer Dragoon Saga. Panzer Dragoon Saga on the Saturn, which I actually own a copy of. It was very difficult to get hold of. Even in Europe, I basically went out to purchase it that day. My friend bought a copy, and he said, "Paul, there's a copy of Panzer Dragoon Saga," and I was like, "Oh, damn, I forgot this was available." Because back then, of course, you didn't have the internet constantly reminding you of things. So I pretty much just called up a couple of local game stores And one of them said, yeah, we've got a copy. I was like, please reserve me that copy. And it was very limited run. And now, if you go to eBay, if you don't believe me, Panzer Dragoon Saga is worth a crap ton of cash. And of course, Panzer Dragoon Saga is not the only game. There are games which are far rarer. My point being that now games like Panzer Dragoon Saga, like Guardian Heroes on the Saturn as well, although to be fair, that was released on the Xbox Live Arcade. All of these games are damn well amazing titles, but of course people just can't experience them. And I think this is one of the things that Microsoft don't want to happen with the original Xbox, where you have a lot of really awesome games, but you just can't play them on modern hardware. Of course, buying those games now is quite difficult as well. So perhaps this is just a step in the right direction. Personally, I don't want a Netflix style service. I've said this from the beginning of time. I don't want games to be subscription based. I don't like it. I like to physically own a copy. However, if we can have a choice between running them physically, so for example, let's say you own a copy of Ninja Gaiden Black on the Xbox, for example, and you can plop it into your Xbox One X and run it that way, fantastic. However, if you could buy it also digitally because you missed out on that back in the day, and therefore you can run it in that method, that would also be pretty spiffy as well. It's a very weird position we are in gaming, and honestly I could probably do a pretty lengthy video on my thoughts on this, and this is more of a news / quick video, so I don't really want to, and to be honest I really need to think and do a lot of research on it. I'm very curious on your thoughts. Do you feel that a Netflix service would be good? I could possibly imagine it, like I could actually see a really compelling reason to have cloud-based services for like retro games, like games even prior to the PS1. Like Sega have a library of games which is just vast. Nintendo have a library of games which is just vast, but let's face it, they're not going to do that. Konami, I mean, God, Konami's library back in the day. I mean, even Capcom games. I mean, just between Konami and Capcom, and I'm not, I'll just go between the two companies randomly. You've got, of course, all of the Street Fighter games, Final Fight. You've got, of course, Strider, Contra, the old Castlevanias. And this is about me trying. You've got all the bloody old school Japanese RPGs, which just, they're still there, but they're nowhere near as easy to be able to get and play. Of course, you've got emulators, by all stretch of the imagination. It's not difficult to emulate a game anymore, and there are some fantastic emulators available and some ROMs, but I think, honestly, a lot of people would just like to plonk down cash and just say, hey, we've got this game. So, yeah, okay, I kind of went off the main topic of this video, but it does beg a lot of questions. What do you think of this one? With all of that said, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.